I'm Liam.
I'm Wayne,
You're listening to In Film We Trust YouTube.
a place where we post clips from our recent episode.
All links down below in the description.
And now, on with the show.
Folk horror, a genre that's been in vogue for the past decade or so, hasn't it?
Very much so, yeah.
Kind of arose from the 60s counterculture. And to get a perspective of how this arose, you've got to remember in the 60s there was this movement, what became known as the New Age movement.
Yeah.
Kind of people were going back to the land, they were kind of eschewing the 50s values, the consumer values, and, you know, people were starting communes again.
Yeah.
Then you had the whole cults and everything, interest in more esoteric religions like paganism, for example, and you can see all these parallels with what would become known later as the folk horror genre.
Folk horror, yeah. And it's, funny enough, it's very popular in East Asia.
East Asia.
I was reading bits like Indonesia and Malaysia have a lot of them, because if you think about it, a lot of these folk horror things, they're based on like these old folk tales. So say parents would tell children their stories before bedtime, and it was usually stories with a moral. Also, it was something like, it was a threat in it for someone. If you don't do this, such and such will come for you. So there was almost like a kind of hidden threat in a lot of these stories.
Well, like even the boogeyman, for example.
Exactly,
Which
yeah.
can actually make it hard to decipher in some ways, because a lot of horror is dealing with the supernatural, with the boogeyman, for example. And what would you say is some themes, what make it folk? Landscape, the land, work in the land, small communities, rural communities.
I think for me, one thing is it's a threat that's more in your imagination. It's a threat, again, that's been passed through a story, because there's some kind of hidden threat. Don't do this or this will happen. Don't go here, this will happen. So, but when you look at folk and supernatural horror, a lot of lines are quite blurred. It's hard to tell, because some films, it might be a folk story, but it might have some supernatural elements like woven into the narrative.
I also find what it does is it subverts that romanticized countryside living.
It does, yeah.
Because you take like stereotypes of maybe more urban people think of the countryside. It's idyllic. It's very community based.
Yeah.
It's away from the hustle and bustle. But folk horror, I typically find, it subverts them ideas. It will use them. It uses them well. For example, the tight-knit community, which we find in The Wicker Man.
Yeah, exactly.
It subverts that, where people become so tight-knit and they almost have this core belief in something that an outsider doesn't. And it can impact in very negative ways.
It can. One film that I think covers this, and it's not a folk horror film, a comedy film, With Nail and I.
Yeah.
Because the idea is they're in the city and they're like, right, we need to get away from this stress. Let's go into the country. It'll be nice. It'll be peaceful. And they just hate it. Everything is bad. It's bad locals, bad weather, stuff like this. So yeah, films like this, they're made from a perspective of, we live in the city, it's so much hustle and bustle, we need to get out into the country where everything is good and it's peaceful, and it's not. You have all of these things, like you say in The Wicker Man, because it's paganism.
Paganism, yeah.
Yeah, for me, The Wicker Man, it was similar to Deliverance. It was like the kind of civilized world clashing with the old world, because he's a Christian, isn't he, the copper?
He's quite a devout Christian.
He's a very devout Christian, and he comes over and he's horrified by this paganism, this sacrilege, and like you say, it subverts the expectations, because it's a cult basically on this island.
Well, you're supposed to see the countryside as comforting, and this, obviously, as we keep saying, it subverts this, and it's subverting what this community sees as their own social order. There's almost their own morality.
Yeah.
And how that clashes with the modern morality.
And in 2010, actually, Mark Gatiss, the actor, who I know mostly for League of Gentlemen, he made a documentary called A History of Horror, and he covered 3 films he called the Unholy Trinity. We got Wicker Man, Witchfinder General from 1968 with Vincent Price, and in 1970, The Blood on Satan's Claw, which is said by a lot of people to be the first kind of archetypal folk horror movie.
Well, as you said with Mark Gatiss, in his documentary, A History of Horror, that's actually where the director of Blood and Satan's Claw...
Piers Haggard?
Piers Haggard. That's where they popularised the term folk horror. It wasn't the first time it had been used. Piers Haggard had also referenced it in a 2003 Fangoria article.
Yes.
And even before that, in 1970, there was a piece in Kine Weekly, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, where writer Rod Cooper called Haggard's film, The Blood and Satan's Claw, a study in folk horror, which was the very first time that term was used.
I mean, just listen to the synopsis. It follows the residents of a rural village whose youth falls under the influence of a demonic presence when a buried skull is found. So it's like, there's no supernatural elements. This is all just in people's imagination.
And Gatiss also made reference that these new at the time, you know, these films, folk horror films from the late 60s and early 70s, they diverted from what traditional Hammer horror films were doing of the time, where there would still be the gothic cliches. You know what I mean? The castle, the vampires,
Yeah.
etc.
The classic Dracula old school horror film.
And this was moving away from that and attaching kind of the social mores of the time, of the, you know, the 60s counterculture.
So what, you think this was like a backlash of that, of just a moving away from that?
To a point, yeah. I think it was taking ideas, what people were having of this time, this moving back to this back to nature movement, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Against consumerism. And it was using those ideas in a horrific setting.
So it's natural that what people were doing at the time, the lifestyle people had, would eventually basically make its way into pop culture.
Because many of these films are set in 1700s, would you say, is kind of the predominant...
Definitely. Well, something like Witchfinder General, that was like 1600s, because that was the height of the witch burning, the witch trials in the UK.
So they're using all these, the witch trials, the 1600s way of living, and modernise it with important themes for that time.
Exactly, yeah. And also, have you noticed in the last, say, 10 odd years, there's been something of a resurgence of this kind of horror film, the kind of what I call like the slow burn horror films. Like, did you see, for example, The Witch?
The Witch is good, yeah.
The Witch is very good.
Is that Robert Eggers?
Robert Eggers.
Yep.
Also Robert Eggers, The Lighthouse.
The Lighthouse.
I like that more than The Witch, actually. I love The Lighthouse.
Midsummer.
Midsummer as well.
And you can't forget, Wayne, our first episode.
Yeah.
Kill List.
Kill List, also, which again wove elements of that into the modern day.
And also his other film, A Field in England.
In England.
Ben Wheatley's other film.
I've yet to see that. That'd be good. Also, did you see Gretel and Hansel?
No.
That was kind of part folk, part supernatural. It had more supernatural elements, but it had, again, the rustic setting, kind of out in the woods kind of thing. But it kind of wove folk and horror elements and supernatural elements together.
Obviously, because this is a retroactive term, what can you place in folk horror? Because to me, and I may be far off here, but a Blair Witch Project.
Yeah.
That's rural. You're taking a mythology. That to me seems kind of
for me,
folk horror.
Folk horror is like a monster movie just without the monster.
Yeah.
The monster is imaginary. It's metaphorical, for example. But I can see where you come from there, because it's just it's just three people out in the woods who... You don't see anything.
You're in a rural local community.
Again.
There's the mythology of the town or village.
You have the people talking about the stories they've heard. So we're not seeing any of these bad things. We're only seeing what the characters are
exactly,
seeing.
Yeah. We may be onto something here, Wayne, unless somebody has lumped that in.
Yes, maybe they have, yeah.
And talking of this whole revival, Jean, the co-writer of this film, also is co-writing, Robert Eggers' new film, The Northman.
I'm looking forward to that.